They could consolidate power, an election in Portugal stripped Rosa Coutinho of his influence. The MPLA and Coutinho then turned to Fidel Castro for military aid. Juan Benamelis, a former African affairs specialist with the Cuban Foreign Ministry.
In June, there was a meeting in Havana. In June 1975, between General Carlos Fabias, Colonel Varela Gomez, and Rosa Coutinho, they went to Havana. And they had a meeting with Senén Casas Regueiro, Chief of Army Staff, with Julio Casas Regueiro, Chief of Logistics of Cuban Army, with Vecino Alegret, who was after one of the generals who acted in Angola, who the Rear Admiral of the Cuban Navy, Emilio Baez. And it was already a military meeting. I'm talking June 1975. A meeting headed by Rosa Coutinho in Havana with the high Cuban military in order to develop the military help that the Soviets were providing and the Cubans in a way that will facilitate at the 11th of November 1975 the power to the MPLA.
I spent most of my time in Havana, well, having talks with the people on the ministers. I was interested especially on education and justice.
So, from June, July, August, already the discussion of the big, heavily Cuba-Soviet involvement was taking place between the Cubans, the Soviets, and the Portuguese. And in all this mess, Rosa Coutinho was mixed and was a key factor.
The three groups reflected different tribal alliances. The FNLA controlled the north, the MPLA held Luanda, Angola's capital, and UNITA, representing Angola's largest tribe, nearly half of Angola's population, held the south and central regions. Bruce Porter, former economics officer with the American consulate in Luanda, had direct dealings with the MPLA.
And the MPLA military leaders said, "You don't really believe there are going to be elections, do you?" Now, this was at the same time MPLA and everybody else was saying there were going to be elections. And we looked at him, we said, "Well, yes, why shouldn't we believe it?" And he said, "Well, because we'd lose." And it was just that simple.
While Bruce Porter was sending dispatches from Luanda, the CIA sent for John Stockwell, just out of Vietnam, as officer in charge of Tay Ninh province.
So they took me down to Washington after 3 months to the day after we left Saigon. The first plane load of arms went into Angola. And they called me up and flew me down in a hurry and told me that the communists were making a big move again in Angola and that Kissinger wasn't going to let them get by with it, and that the CIA had been ordered to stop them because of the political situation. The U.S. Army couldn't do it. We had to do it secretly. It was the most sensitive, one of the biggest operations in CIA history and the most sensitive one in recent years. It was a fabulous break to my career, but I was being put in charge of this thing. I was the chief of the Angola task force. I would sit on a subcommittee of the National Security Council, and I would manage this global program that focused into saving Angola.
Angola was also the focus of Fidel Castro's aspirations. In 1976, he claimed that the Cuban Expeditionary Force was a response to a South African invasion.
We have the proof that at least the regular units with artillery and tanks began the invasion on the 23rd of October. The first Cuban unit arrived between the 5th and the 10th of November, after the invasion by South Africa had taken place.
But in fact, Cuban troops had begun landing in Angola in mid-September, a full month before the South Africans crossed the border. Luis Echegoyen was among the first Cubans spirited into Angola.
We were called up for an important mission. Our training lasted 45 days and we left for Angola on September 18th. We were flown in as tourists, around 150 combat troops, 8 to 10 officials, some lieutenants, and a colonel who was in command.
Echegoyen and the others arrived in civilian dress, unarmed, and registered at Hotel Presidente in Luanda.
The first direct evidence that those of us in Luanda had that the Cubans were actually in Luanda came about in a very strange way. A Cuban-American working for an American bank in Angola was walking past the reception desk of his hotel. He saw a young girl with 7 or 8 young males, all of whom were exceedingly fit, all about the same age, and with short haircuts. And it immediately occurred to him that there was something strange about this group. They didn't speak Portuguese, so he sidled up to the reception desk and he saw their Cuban passports.
The next day, when we got to the outskirts of Luanda to a military camp, they gave us uniforms, took away our suitcases, and gave us Soviet guns.
And in September, the Cubans brought in 700 regular Army troops, not advisors, but regular Army soldiers. In late September, and then in October, we brought in the South African Armored Column. And then the Cubans responded by establishing a bridge and bringing in what eventually totaled 40,000 troops with tanks and jets and everything.
Over a decade after the fact, and in the wake of peace talks, Castro insists that the 50,000 Cubans sent to Angola were a response to South African aggression.
And not do anything fair than to help the Angolan people.
Históricamente está probado.
Historically, it has been proved
¿De qué?
that
Fueron los surafricanos.
it was the South
Y
Africans
las tropas de Zaire las que
And the
iniciaron
Zaire
la invasión de Angola.
who began Angola's invasion.
Cronológicamente.
So, chronologically.
This is General Rafael Del Pino. His voice and appearance have been disguised for his protection. This exclusive interview took place in a Washington safe house. As the former commander of the Cuban Air Forces in Angola, General Del Pino refutes President Castro's justification for sending troops.
We went into Angola in the mid-1975, first with a few hundred advisors. Then we continued increasing the military personnel until the first day of October.
On the 1st of October, how large was your army?
We had about 2,000 men, and the South Africans started their penetration into Angolan territory on the 23rd of October.
With the aid of 2,000 Cuban troops, the MPLA was able to extinguish the FNLA challenge for Luanda. In the old colonial capital, the MPLA became, as Rosa Coutinho intended, the successors to the Portuguese. But UNITA would make its stand here, in the countryside. And although Jonas Savimbi was supported by the majority of the Angolan people, they stood alone. UNITA was overlooked by the Americans.
Nobody knew much about Savimbi. Savimbi didn't hit the international cocktail circuit the way FNLA and MPLA activists and leaders did. Savimbi stayed in Angola tending to his business.
The program began in July. By early August, I had been brought up and was putting my staff together.